I'd like to invite the first speaker, Mr. Stan Karp.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks. I appreciate being invited to come today. As Lorenzo said, I am a staff person at the Education Law Center. Before that, I taught high school in Patterson for 30 years. I taught English and we have a plant in the audience, a former student who, so I don't know if he looks less like he did than he did when we last saw each other, but Frank, it's good to see you. I was asked to speak to you today about the current framework for education reform in New Jersey and about what has become an increasingly polarized national debate around education policy. And not only a national debate, but a polarized debate at the local and state level as well as at the national level. And this polarization is shaping a lot of decisions that are being made about some very important issues. Issues like charter school policy, issues like testing and assessment policy, issues like school funding, and teacher evaluation. And while each of these issues is extremely important, it's also important to keep the big picture in mind, because a lot of the decisions that are being made are being shaped by this larger debate about the current and future direction of public education policy. Now, I have spent a large portion of my life complaining about public education, about the flawed policies and institutions of education, of schools, as a parent, as a teacher, and as an education advocate. But these days, I find I spend a lot of my time defending public education from people who say it should be blown up or replaced with something else, quite literally sometimes. Now, it's important to remember that criticizing public education does not make you an enemy of public schools. But it's important to remember, too, that the parent who's angry at a public school system that may not be doing a great job of educating his or her child is not the same as the billionaire like Bill Gates or Eli Broad or Sam Walton, who has no education experience, who could not last in a public school for a day, and who has made privatizing education policy a hobby, and who has the resources to do it through very powerful political groups, because the political and economic systems in our country are stacked in favor of the 1%. And likewise, the hard-pressed taxpayer who may be directing frustration at teachers over their efforts to keep their pensions or their health care, which far too few people in the society have at all, is not the same as the people responsible for the unbelievable economic inequality that's squeezing all of us. So it's important to remember these differences when we're talking about school policies, because we are not saying that these policies should not be subject to criticism or should not be subject to debate. But right now there is a new consensus among some very powerful and well-financed forces in both major parties, in both major political camps, that believe that public education costs too much, that schools should do more with less, that the current public education system should be replaced by some kind of new governance and delivery system that are based on market principles, that treats parents and students as customers seeking services instead of citizens seeking rights. They want to open up access to what's a $600 billion annual expenditure in K-12 education. They want to open that up to commercial penetration and do for schools what the market has done for housing, healthcare, and employment, which create fabulous opportunities and profits for a few and unequal access and outcomes for the many. On the other hand, there are people who believe, including myself, that investment in public education needs to increase dramatically in order to close gaps in opportunity and outcomes, that public education remains a vital civic institution, maybe the last place in an increasingly diverse and divided society where people still come together for a common purpose, and that public oversight and local control of education policy remain absolutely critical to a democratic society. These two competing visions are having a significant impact on a whole range of decisions being made about how our schools should be funded, how they should be governed, and how they should be staffed. We have just completed, for example, a 10-year experiment in school reform called No Child Left Behind. Last February, New Jersey became one of the first 10 states to get a waiver from this law by the federal government that Lorenzo referred to, that allowed the New Jersey Department of Education to set up something called Regional Achievement Centers to intervene in about 250 schools that have been labeled priority schools or focus schools. I think there are about 10 here in Bergen County. And all schools in New Jersey are about to be taken on another school reform adventure called the Common Core, which is a new set of standards and tests that are supposed to do what the last round of standards and tests were supposed to do, which is ensure a quality education for all kids. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about all these moving parts and how they fit together, and where the people who are promoting them seem to be taking us, and how we might go in another direction. The NCLB waivers that have been granted to New Jersey and to now 34 other states are waivers from the current version of the main federal education law, which is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The ESEA, as it's known, was first passed in 1965. It was part of the War on Poverty. It provides things like Title I funding for schools that serve high-poverty communities. It provides for Head Start, the early childhood program. It provides for things like bilingual education and other social programs. And when it was passed in 1965 and renewed in the 70s, about every 6 or 7 years, it reflected the historical purpose of federal education policy, which was to expand access and equity by supporting things like school integration, extra funding for poor schools, special education for kids with disabilities. But over the last several decades, federal education policy has shifted away from this focus on equity as the main concern of federal policy. And instead, it's been replaced by a new and much less equitable set of federal mandates around accountability, standards, and testing. And this shift in federal policy eventually led to the No Child Left Behind law, which in fact was simply the Elementary Secondary Education Act when it was passed in 2002 and was given a name by the sponsors of the reauthorization at that time, who were, again, from both parties. This was from Ted Kennedy and George Bush, and it was an agreement to increase federal spending on education, which actually is a very small part of the overall spending, in return for what it called an increase in accountability. A decade of NCLB, which was passed in 2002, ended last year, 2012. And what did we get? What we got was a massive expansion in standardized testing. Before NCLB, there were 19 states that tested every kid in every grade between the ages of 3 to 8. Today, under federal mandate, all 50 do. This is great for testing companies. When the president of Pearson Education, one of the largest test publishers in the world, saw NCLB, he said, wow, this looks like our business plan. This is great for us. And it was, because there was a tremendous increase in the preparation and the purchase and the investment in commercial standardized tests. But testing every kid, every year, in every grade, and then measuring the results against standards that no real schools have ever met, was never an accountability system. It was a way to create a narrative of failure that allowed certain sanctions and penalties to be imposed on schools for not reaching unrealistic targets. Now, it was a great idea to break down what they call disaggregate the scores, so you could see that some students were not doing as well as other students. But then these gaps were used to label schools as failures without providing the resources or strategies needed to eliminate the gaps. And so what we got was a tremendous narrative of public education as a failure that has reduced public support for education, that has increased support for the kind of disruptive reforms that erode the common support that a universal system of public education needs, and that have put us in the situation we are today. Now, there is widespread agreement today that NCLB was a failure in its two main goals. It did not raise student achievement across the board, and it did not narrow the gaps among the different groups of students in our public schools. But it did succeed in creating this narrative of failure. And the truth is that standardized test scores, for a long time, have been disguising class and race privilege as merit. Standardized tests put a number on differences that actually reflect the inequality all around our schools. And that's what the scores really reflected. It not only reflected what was going on in schools, it was reflecting the issues that kids and families were bringing to those schools every day. And the idea that simply reflecting those in numbers was going to lead to solutions was a false premise. NCLB set up schools and districts to fail, and especially schools serving poor, high-needs communities. There are about 100,000 schools in the United States, about 100,000 public schools. By 2011, 50,000 of them, half of them, were on the list of failing schools, failing to meet NCLB's benchmarks. The benchmarks were continuing to rise to the point the benchmark was that all kids in 10 different subgroups, 100% of them had to pass the state tests by a certain year. And the closer we got to that year, the more schools were unable to meet that. And it got to a point where it was not only schools in communities with high poverty and high need students that were not meeting those requirements. It got to reach to middle class schools and suburban schools. And there were more and more schools that had to explain to their communities why they were on this list of failing schools. And so the pressure to modify the system increased. And this is eventually where the waivers came from. By the time President Obama was elected, it was almost universally acknowledged that the NCLB had to change. It actually offered a chance in this national debate to step back and look at the overuse and misuse of standardized tests to drive reform and to change course. Unfortunately, that did not happen. Instead, what we got was a doubling down on these policies. We had expanded use of test scores, not only to rate the schools and the students, but now to rate the teachers and the principals. It moved federal education, and by it I mean the Obama administration, and like most of the people in this room, I supported and voted for the Obama administration, and have been horrified by the education policies coming out from Secretary Duncan, and that don't represent the kind of education that President Obama is giving to his own children at some very wonderful schools that are not subject to these mandates. It also began to move under this administration federal education aid away from investment in the equity programs like Title I and Head Start, and distributed federal aid on the basis of competitive grants, based on things like adopting the specific political pet reforms that were in Race to the Top. So, for example, the administration used Race to the Top funds to require schools to expand the use of test scores to evaluate teachers, to increase the number of charter schools, to agree to close down schools or to institute what are called turnarounds, where staff is fired and schools are closed and reopened, sometimes as charters or sometimes on a different basis. But all these proposals, states had to adopt them just to apply, just to be eligible to apply for federal funds. So these policies were not adopted because they were proven effective as school improvement strategies. They were adopted because they were the politically favored reforms of a group of people who had captured national education policy, which includes large private foundations like Gates, Broad, and Walton, and which includes lots of political people who thought that this was a way to reduce the public's investment in public education and to move large amounts of public education funding from public to private uses. The effects of these policies have been chaotic. Excuse me a minute, I got to do a Marco Rubio. I didn't bend this. The effects of these policies have been chaotic, especially in urban areas. In the last 4 years, there have been almost 4,000 public schools closed. That's a 60% increase over 10 years before that. In cities like Detroit, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Philadelphia, districts have been hollowed out. And already vulnerable communities have lost some of their most important public assets. During the same period, the number of charter schools has increased by 50%. We now have over 6,000 publicly funded but privately managed charter schools. Whatever you think about charter schools, whatever you think the original purpose and the current impact of charter schools was or should be. This is a tremendous transfer of public assets from public oversight and control to private or semi-private ownership of control. It's having an extremely disruptive impact on many districts. Just to be more specific about the kind of policies that are associated with the kind of education reform I am talking about that is being promoted both by federal and state policy right now, I'm talking about increased test-based evaluation of students, teachers, and schools of education, which are next. The elimination or weakening of tenure, seniority, and collective bargaining rights. An end to pay for experience for advanced degrees or experience. Closing schools deemed low-performing and the replacement by publicly funded by privately run charters. Replacing governance by local school boards, which are likely to be the next target of the obstacles to these policies. Replacing governance by local school boards with various forms of mayoral and state takeover or private management. Vouchers and tax credits for subsidies for private school tuition. Increasing in class size, sometimes tied to reducing, firing 10 to 15% of the staff, and then you increase the class sizes with the staff that remains. And implementation of something called the Common Core Standards and Tests, which is another expansion of computer-based testing aligned with these standards. Together, all these strategies use test-based accountability rhetoric to extend the policies you've seen under No Child Left Behind and to drill down even further into the fabric of schooling, transform the teaching profession, and very frankly, to try to create a less experienced, less stable, less secure, and less expensive professional staff. As the number of schools facing sanction, NCLB became increasingly unpopular. It was actually even more unpopular than the Congress had created it. And eventually this led to the waivers. The coalition that had originally supported NCLB collapsed, and Congress was too gridlocked and too divided to reauthorize it. So the only way that they could come up with to avoid this increasing pressure, especially on the schools that were in the suburban and urban communities, was to come up with this waiver. Now, it is a very dubious legal position for a cabinet secretary to issue a waiver from a federal law. The legal basis of these waivers is contested, but the practical basis is in place. Okay. Basically, the administration said that if states agreed to implement the reforms the administration was supporting, it would release them from the waiver. It would release them from the regular NCLB rules through the waiver. To qualify for a waiver, this is what states had to do. They had to implement test-based teacher evaluation, expansion of charter schools, and aggressive interventions in the 15% of schools that had the lowest test scores or the biggest achievement gaps. These are the priority focus schools. States that agreed to do this got waivers that basically allowed the other 85% of the schools off the hook. They had to do some reporting, but they no longer faced the sanctions that they faced under NCLB, while the poorest communities would face closures and increasing sanctions. In February, New Jersey became one of the first states to get this waiver, and New Jersey began identifying and intervening in schools with the lowest test scores that they called priority schools, and the ones with the biggest achievement gaps that they call focus schools. And it set up these regional achievement centers staffed with experts, they said, giving these schools 2 to 3 years to improve their test scores or to face even more aggressive intervention. Now, I don't think it'll come as a surprise to you that the schools targeted for the RAC interventions overwhelmingly serve poor communities of color. Statewide, there are about 40% of the students in New Jersey schools are students of color, black or Hispanic, 33% are poor, and about 4% are limited English proficiency students. But in the RAC schools, 97% of the students are black or Latino, 81% are poor, and 7% are English language learners. In the focus schools, over 70% are black and Hispanic, 63% are poor, 10% are English language learners. The student mobility rate in priority schools is a staggering 24%. These are schools located in the poorest high-need districts in the state of New Jersey that are being subject to closure or intervention by a policy that has no track record as success. I was a high school teacher for 30 years in Patterson. This was a state takeover district for 20 of those years. We have not seen tremendous capacity by the state to improve low-performing schools. The idea that they are now going to intervene in these 250 schools based on these regional achievement centers, again, is experimenting with our children. It is not imposing proven reform strategies that either support communities, support schools, or support educators. And by contrast, there are about 112 schools that they're calling reward schools that are going to get cash bonuses for high test scores. These schools, only 20% of the kids are Black and Latino, only 15% of the kids are poor, and only 2% are English language learners. And many of those schools are highly selective reward schools, magnet schools, that are highly selective in their populations, and I know you've had some experience with that here in England. If the priority and focus schools don't improve to the department's satisfaction, they face possible closure, being turned into charters, or being turned over to private management. The commissioner has claimed the authority to take over these low-performing schools, just like the department has claimed the authority to take over low-performing districts. It is claimed that the commissioner somehow has the right to reach into a district and take over a particular school, which there seems to be no statutory authority to do and will be contested if it's attempted. He's also talked about creating what they call an achievement district, modeled on the policies in Detroit and the policies in New Orleans, where public schools were removed from public oversight and school board management and placed in the hands of private management as authorized by the state. This privatization and state control replaces local public democratic oversight by parents and citizens with control by distant bureaucracies who manage these schools with data systems instead of real on-the-ground support. New Jersey Department of Education says it will implement targeted interventions designed to provide proven turnaround principles. Now, these turnaround principles that you'll hear a lot about include a number of very highly disruptive policies that have created havoc in urban schools across the country. They allow the RACs to fire the principal, to replace 50% or more of the staff, and to require everyone in the turnaround school to reapply for their jobs. And though federal guidelines pay lip service to parent involvement, in practice, parents have been almost totally excluded from this process. Under New Jersey's waiver plans, the RACs also claim that they can take control of 30% of the school's Title I funds to support the interventions they want to see. This means that the school's current Title I funding and programs can be dramatically changed simply at the order of the RAC administrators. Now, while this is going on in 75 priority schools and 153 focus schools and 87 districts in New Jersey, all New Jersey schools, not only the priority and focus schools, are facing mandates to implement the new Teach New Jersey Act for test-based teacher and principal evaluation, and the expanded testing that's coming down the road with the implementation of the new Common Core standards. We could spend a whole town hall just on the testing issues, because everybody is going to be dealing with this. The Common Core curriculum, let's just say that this is another wrong-headed experiment in top-down school reform moved by standards and tests. The Common Core curriculum are standards that were written by educational consultants, paid by the Gates Foundation, and allied with the National Governors Association. These Common Core curriculum standards have never been implemented anywhere. They are aligned with tests that have not been created, that have to be given on computers that schools don't have. And yet now, this is supposed to be the magic cure for the miracle solution for making all our kids college and career ready in a society that has never sent more than 1/3 of our kids through to college, and in a state where there isn't a single college that has a graduation completion rate above 60%. When an urban high school has a graduation completion rate of 60%, it is considered a dropout factor. Every one of our colleges is aligned to a system that is not serving our kids, and yet we are simply aligning harder standards and tests. NCLB proved that we have millions and millions of our kids not meeting current standards and tests. So the solution our leaders are offering are more and harder standards and tests. Let me know if this makes sense to you. Because this is a formula set up for NCLB 2 to create yet another even deeper narrative of failure, to drive this status of dismantling and privatizing our public education system. These policies do nothing to reduce the concentrations of 70, 80, 90% poverty that remain the central problem in urban education. The number one problem in our schools is the inequality all around. It's not the kids, it's not the parents, it's not the teachers. Absolutely, every one of those groups can and should do a better job of educating all our kids and building the partnerships our schools and the communities they serve need. But the rhetoric we're hearing these days about how poverty is no excuse for school failure has itself become an excuse for ignoring the poverty and for failing to address adequately the host of family issues, community and social issues that kids bring to school with them in the morning. Instead, educational inequality is now the entry point for a kind of disruptive reform that increases instability in one of our most important and precious public institutions and that creates new forms of damage in our most vulnerable communities. The NCLB waivers represent a retreat from equity funding and the program mandates here in New Jersey of the Abbott era, and they represent a blank check to governors and education commissioners that seek to erode school funding, reduce local control, and privatize the making of public policy. Fortunately, however, parents and communities have begun to push back. In just the last few months, we've seen the Chicago Teachers Union, in strong partnership built over many difficult years with the parents in their town, launch a powerful and win a powerful strike against the policies of testing and closing schools. And in support of broad-based, well-rounded education programs for all kids that include not just test prep, but include music and art and air-conditioned classrooms and the kind of things that really make a difference to parents and families. Just last month, parents, youth, and activists from 18 cities, including Newark, went on a journey for justice to D.C. to protest the federal policies that are promoting school closings and disruptive reform. Right now, teachers at Garfield High School and other high schools in Seattle are standing up for their students and refusing to give another useless standardized test called the MAT test that they say hurts their students and violates their standards of professional practice. Here in New Jersey, we have growing grassroots groups like Save Our Schools New Jersey, a statewide coalition like Our Children, Our Schools, local groups like the groups that have put together this meeting today, PACE, Pulse, Citizens for Public Education, Concerned Citizens Coalition, who organized today's town hall, all working together for a better direction for our schools. In fact, just this week, many of these groups worked together to block changes in the state legislature, in the school funding formula that would cut support for our most high-need students and schools. There is much more that we have to do, and I know we'll be talking about that today. So let me just end with this message. Public pressure can change public policy. The pushback against corporate education is building in New Jersey. It's building in the country. We need to build it here today, and we need to take the direction of public education policy. And so we can survive, public education can provide a quality education for all our kids. Thank you.